Hello, friends, and welcome to Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly podcast designed to help mainstream Texans of faith understand the legislative process and help you engage with the Texas legislature. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and today we turn our focus back to the special session with a conversation about public school funding with Dr. Chloe Latham Sikes, Deputy Director of Policy with IDRA, the Intercultural Development Research Association. For 50 years, IDRA has focused on equity in the Texas education system, and Chloe brings an important perspective to the public education conversation. As of posting, we are finishing the third week of a 30-day legislative session, and Texans of faith have been doing incredible work to support Texas public schools. Thousands of you have signed Texas Impact's Public Dollars for Public Schools letter, and those letters and comments have been delivered straight to your representatives' capital offices. Keep them coming. Your representatives need to hear from you and your friends, especially your friends outside of Texas's urban centers. So sign and then share widely. To stay up to date on the special session and all that is public policy in the great state of Texas, check out the Texas Impact website at texasimpact.org and join our rapid response team to stay up to date on how you can engage there. As always, feel free to reach out at scott@texasimpact.org if you have questions about the program or ways that you can get involved. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this week's conversation with Dr. Chloe Latham Sikes. Joining us for today's conversation is Dr. Chloe Latham Sikes, Deputy Director of Policy with IDRA. Chloe, thank you so much for joining us today. I know we've been big fans watching your legislative testimony over the course of this year.
I am honored for the invitation, and we're big fans of Texas Impact's work. Thank you.
Oh, that is so kind. That is so kind. Let's start off with an introduction to IDRA. Talk to us about the organization, what y'all do, and how you're engaged in the legislative session.
Sure. So IDRA stands for the Intercultural Development Research Association, but we're better known as IDRA or IDRA. We produce a lot of information and work with a lot of bilingual communities. So we go by IDRA or IDRA as you like, but our mission is to achieve equal educational opportunities for every child through strong public schools that prepare all students to access and succeed in college. And we've been doing this for now slightly over 50 years. We're celebrating our 50th year this year. That was technically our birthday was April 1st of this year. And we have our big blowout gala coming up here in a couple weeks on November 2nd to celebrate 50 years of this work, which we are very proud to celebrate and honor that legacy. Sometimes it's frustrating to be engaged in the same fights as we were 50 years ago. Certainly I wasn't, but members of our team, some of them were on staff at that time and are still here today. But we're really proud of that legacy of work. And we work in classrooms as well as through direct educational practice and technical assistance with leadership and academic programs. And we work in the Capitol building. We work on local, state, and federal policy and advocacy and engage communities through strategic communications across that work as well to advocate for equity in education.
I love everything about that answer. Also, in case you didn't know, Texas Impact just celebrated our 50-year anniversary as well. So
I saw. Congratulations.
Congrats to y'all. We should have a joint birthday party or something like that. There needs to be cake. So for those 50 years, when I hear your description, it's clear that public education and equitable public education is a priority to you all. And Texas Impact, like IDRA, has opposed vouchers, and we've opposed them for 50 years. But talk to us about why you all specifically oppose private school vouchers.
Sure. So in our work, particularly around equitable educational opportunities for all students, and we were founded 50 years ago from the fight for fair school funding coming out of the 1973 Rodriguez versus San Antonio ISD Supreme Court decision, which essentially said there's not a protected federal right to adequate or equitable funding for public education. It's the state's duty to provide it. And IDRA disagreed, or our founders disagreed with that decision and said, we're going to start an organization to provide, research and policy and practice support to advocate for fair school funding. We work kind of soup to nuts on a lot of pre-K through 12 types of policy issues, but that continues to be one of our founding and priority areas to this day. So with fair school funding, that is about supporting full equity as well as increased levels of funding in our public schools, which must serve all students. And I said all students in our mission and saying it now, but IDRA's focus is on centering Black, Latino, and emergent bilingual students, students from lower-income households, really placing an equity focus on the civil rights of students that have been historically marginalized in various settings and in education, and securing high-quality educational opportunities for them. So school vouchers take us away from all aspects of that mission and those goals. It creates a dual system that is privately operated of state funding that should go to public education. And also, and we can get into this, but there's a lot of research from states that have programs like those on the discrimination for students for admission and enrollment and in their educational services, in parents' access to students' information and the educational services they're provided, and declining or stagnant academic outcomes for students. So there's a whole host of equity concerns with a private school voucher program, but taking funding away from our public schools when we are still, like we are, and as you all have been 50 years fighting for fair school funding that we have not yet achieved, is just takes us away from all of our goals.
You've mentioned equity several times, and when we talk about public school finance, the two phrases that are the biggest cornerstones to that system are equity and adequacy. And since you've started us out down the track talking about equity, what does that mean? How do we define equity, and why is that important in a public education system?
Equity means students with greater needs are getting greater resources to meet them, for schools to meet those needs. And adequacy, while we want to see more funding into the system as a whole, and Texas ranks very low nationwide in overall funding, adequacy is about maintaining or even just establishing a minimum threshold of funding. We want to raise that minimum, and IDRA has been really engaged on the equity piece because we know the students who have the greatest needs also then get the short end of the stick on any type of funding or support or program provision type of conversation. So focusing on equity is really about how do you achieve targeted excellence for students who have been denied those opportunities or marginalized from those opportunities in funding and in other types of educational opportunities. So equity is really about that focused type of investment. For IDRA, bilingual education is a primary priority for us, along with our funding. So focusing on bilingual education funding, teacher supports, high-quality programs, student protections and opportunities has been a big part of the equity conversation.
For those of us who've been involved in this conversation for a while, I think it's obvious how private school vouchers would harm equity in the state. But for people who haven't been paying as much attention, for folks who are going to meet with their representatives, can you talk to us a little more about how a voucher program would exacerbate educational inequity?
Yeah, so there's several key ways. We actually put out some information on this. IDRA has a Stop Vouchers landing page where folks are able to go and look at research, testimony, infographics, get some more resources. But one of the ways it takes money away or exacerbates education inequity is because a vouchers program would take money away from school funding and also tasks the state with funding that inefficient dual system that's privately operated. So that is one system to subsidize private schools and providers for education. And then the other system, which Texas is constitutionally required to provide some level of, our public schools, which must take all students, regardless of the type of educational need or their household income level or where they live. And that puts a strain on those state resources. This has been a big conversation about how these programs would affect school funding and the equity for school funding. And really, any of these private school voucher program proposals would come out of the same pot of money, our general revenue fund, as the foundation school program. 40%, over 40% of our general revenue fund for the state goes to funding public schools. Putting a strain on that system is going to compromise our public school funding. And the students that might opt into that program from our public schools, then their public school loses that per pupil attendance funding. That's how we operate in Texas. We fund schools based on student attendance, and then losing that funding means they've lost that attendance funding, but have to maintain their fixed costs as well as all the state and federal requirements, and meeting those that private providers do not have to meet. So that is a kind of a twofold way that the funding is made inequitable for public schools from the state level, as well as schools losing funding but still having to meet fixed costs and state and federal requirements and serve students' needs for the students there. We also know that private school voucher programs largely subsidize private students already in private schools. And both proposals we've seen this special session from the Senate and the House really have universal eligibility for students already in private schools, regardless of their income level, regardless of their, any particular type of identified need, like special education or otherwise. They would go to subsidize students who are already in private schools. And that's also been the case from what we've seen from other states, putting a real strain on the system. So those are a couple of ways that inequity would really show up from this type of program. And the last one I'll mention is the concern for discrimination and concern for inequities in just accessing educational services that are taxpayer funded. Public schools have to take all students. These types of private programs, private school voucher programs, we've seen in other states that they can deny admission and enrollment and even certain educational services to students. Say, hey, we don't take a student with that particular disability, or we're not equipped to serve students with different language needs because they don't have to take them. They don't have to serve them by any type of state or federal law or regulation. And so that means students can be denied admission, denied really critical educational services, denied based on their discipline record, other types of discretionary criteria as well, income level, ability status. There's all sorts of concerns for how, and documented data to show how these programs can really exacerbate discrimination based on students' identity and racial and socioeconomic segregation in schools.
You've mentioned a couple of times other states and the outcomes you've seen there. Do you have any data on how school voucher programs have impacted students in other states?
We do. I mean, the thing is, we've seen voucher programs floated in other states for past couple decades. So we have the blueprint. We know where these types of programs go, and we have longitudinal studies based on those programs. One really, I think, key example is Florida's program now. And there's several types of private school voucher programs they run. They're called scholarships or different types of, they have different names, but they really all fall under the umbrella of state-funded private school voucher programs, and they now take up 10% of the state's education budget.
Wow.
That is astounding. In a state, especially, when we look to our partner states that are, or comparable states that serve similar demographics of students, large proportions of students, Texas, Florida, New York, California. A program that takes up 10% of the state's education budget is pretty remarkable and very alarming for what the ballooning costs of a program like this could mean for Texas schools. So we do have data on that fiscal impact, also on the discrimination data I mentioned, and on these types of programs not coming through with higher quality education. There's some talk of, there's certainly some private schools that might offer a really solid education, but there's a huge range and it's unmonitored and it's not accountable to the public. And so putting public money into it is what is also deeply concerning. When we've seen studies on how students in these types of programs did in other states like Louisiana, Ohio, Alabama, DC, we see stagnant or declining academic outcomes. And sometimes those students come right back into the public school system and then are behind because they have not been meeting state standards or required to meet state standards through a private type of system. So that academic inequity is also really concerning and something we see in a lot of programs that have existed for several years.
That's helpful, and that's a lot of good conversation and context about the equity piece. Let's shift to adequacy, which I always think is an interesting term. Like, I'd love us to be better than adequate, but that's what we have. So what does adequate mean in the context of public education? Voucher proponents say that the money's coming from a surplus and won't harm public schools. What's your argument against that position?
Yeah, so adequacy, it is disheartening, isn't it, to just be trying to debate and litigate and take things to the court to say, please just make us adequate, give us a minimum.
But at this point, right?
At this point, this is what we got to do. And we have Texas funds schools based on various types of proposals that are not actually grounded in any cost study. We haven't had a cost study in Texas to fund our schools at cost. Now, that's a recommendation that we've put forward in our policy priorities. We would love to see. I think there was a little bit of conversation about that several years ago in the Texas Public School Finance Commission, but we have not had a comprehensive, rigorous cost study that then we align our school funding formula to. So when we say how much does it cost to educate a student in Texas from Dallas to Abilene, we don't know. And so we certainly don't fund them at that level. We fund them far below. So adequacy, establishing adequacy is a question mark, even though it's not where IDRA has focused, but it means establishing that minimum threshold. What are we going to fund students? How are we going to fund students in our schools? That continues to be a big part of the conversation about whatever a public school funding carrot would be for a private school voucher program. We've seen proposals from the Senate and the House this special session around public school funding, acknowledging the importance of increasing public school funding. Neither proposal, I think, increases it at the level that advocates and researchers have said it should be increased to. But there's an acknowledgement we have to increase our funding for public schools. We've fallen behind even what our last investments were in 2019. So adequacy is that minimum level. We continue to discuss that and debate where that's going to be. The truth is we haven't done the math to figure that out quite yet.
Right.
And to your question about the surplus, this goes back to our conversation about where the money comes from. So a private school voucher program right now, the way that it's been proposed, would be just nestled within the general revenue fund for the state. Like I said, over 40% of that goes to our schools. That'd put a strain on that particular type of fund because there's no new other types of state revenue that are intended to accompany this and feed that type of fund, as well as the money coming out of the foundation school program, out of public schools, if students were to actually leave schools to use that program. So even if the money is not within the education fund, it is coming from that same pot of money. The general revenue makes up over about two-thirds of public school funding. So we really can't be compromising how we fund our public schools, and this type of program would do that.
Yeah, I mean, you keep hearing from proponents that the money's coming from the surplus. The money's coming from the surplus. Sure, this biennium, right? But long term, it's all coming from the same pot of money.
Exactly.
I'd love, so disclaimer on this next question. We are recording on Monday, October 23rd. And so things might change by the time this gets aired or the time that you listen to this episode. But as of today, as of Monday, do you have any insights into the arguments that are being made in the legislature so far and how Texans of faith who support public schools can frame their conversations with representatives over the coming days and weeks?
Yeah, so right now we're in what could be called, I guess, maybe a standoff of between legislators in this special session. I mean, the key education conversation has been around these private school voucher programs. The governor has been incredibly explicit for over a year that this is his main priority. And right now we have two very different types of bills that have not gained wholesale support in either chamber. And we have a lot of public outcry that's not what they want. That's not what parents and students and families and stakeholders in public education want to see happen. So right now we are seeing how that might pan out, that conversation pans out with those proposals on the table. I think that the chair of the Public Education Committee has said he won't put forward his bill for a hearing, and he authored the House version, House Bill 1, unless the governor's call is expanded to include also investing in public schools. Right now, the call is limited to just the voucher program, instituting a voucher program. So we are going to wait to see who blinks first. We have heard that, if they run out the 30 days, run out the clock, that they might come back maybe right into the holidays, maybe into early next year as folks are under their primaries and getting their primary campaigns underway, if they might be dragged back to debate these types of issues once again. and take them off the campaign trail. So those types of things have been forecast. But how Texans of Faith can support public schools, I mean, I think the main thing is we know how important our public schools are. The maintenance, it's widely popular, of the separation of church and state in our public schools and where our public school funding goes. And I think continuing to hear that it is not politically dangerous to support your public schools. Is a really key message. We like our public schools. We want our public schools. We want them to be independent and maintain that separation of church and state. And we want transparency and accountability over our tax dollars and over our students' education and how they're doing and where they end up and how well they're educated. That's how we're able to have education policy debates and make things better, because we have that accountability, because we have that data, because we have a level of transparency. And creating a separate private program with none of those guardrails is really concerning. And I think that's why we've continued to have bipartisan opposition to these types of proposals, because it's not popular. So that type of message, all Texans of Faith, you support our public schools. They serve all students, and really maintaining religious liberty is in our public schools. That's where students actually have their religious protections to be met, to be recognized, and in a private setting, that is going to be very different.
And I'll add, our listeners will know, I've said this over the course of the last few weeks, it doesn't matter where you are in the state of Texas. This has been a bipartisan issue, support for public schools. So regardless of whether or not you feel like your representative agrees with you or not, you need to be confirming that. Regardless of what party they are, regardless of where you are in Texas, have the conversations, have the meetings to make sure your representative knows that Texans of Faith in your community support their public schools. So that's the word I will add on to that piece. Chloe, really appreciate the time. Any closing thoughts or shameless plugs you want to leave with us today?
Sure. Well, I mentioned that IDRA is celebrating 50 years this year. We're having our blowout gala, as I said, next week on November 2nd. It is sold out, but encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about our upcoming events and our publications and our resources to subscribe to idra.org. We also are having an archives reception. We have 50 years of papers, publications, research, community engagement stories, and we are donating some existing archives from our founder, donating additional archives to the UT Austin Benson Library on November 16th in the evening, 6 to 8 p.m. The local community, anyone interested, but UT as well as general community members are certainly invited to learn about our legacy for educational justice and how that connects to our current and future plans.
Excellent. Dr. Chloe Latham Sikes, thank you so much for the time today, but more, thank you for continuing to do incredible work in the Texas Capitol and beyond. We're grateful for you and the gift that you are to the state of Texas. So thanks again for the time. Thanks for your work.
Oh, thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Dr. Latham Sikes. I know many of you support Texas public schools, and so I hope she has inspired you to take the next step this week to support Texas school kids and teachers. Texas Impact always has tools for you, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions or if we can support your advocacy work. And one more plug for today. I hope you're all continuing to promote Texas Impact's Public Dollars for Public Schools letter in your congregation and community. Those letters are being hand-delivered to the Capitol, so sign and share quickly. As always, check out texasimpact.org for all the tools and consider joining one of our teams. While you're there, I hope you'll participate in Membership Month by joining Texas Impact this month to support this podcast and the work of Texas Impact year-round. So with that, I think it's time to close out this episode, so remember, the world needs Texans of Faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnett, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.